I think we could probably just start our quick introductions. So thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar that we're calling Is Test Optional Admissions Enough? And as Akil, one of our speakers said, is it ever enough? And answer is, are we going to cover it all? No, it's a short webinar, but is it enough? Absolutely not. I'm Marie Bigham. I'm the founder and executive director of Accept, which is Admissions Community, Cultivating Equity and Peace Today. And I'm excited to have these two really brilliant speakers, scholars, and just dazzling people all together talk with us today about test optional and test blind college admissions and what comes after that to have truly equitable and just admissions, which I hope for all of us is the goal. We're going to record this and email this to anyone who signed up, so we're excited to be able to share this afterwards. And the two folks we have today, I'll let them introduce themselves further when they speak, but Dr. Dominique Baker, who is at SMU, and a brilliant writer about higher ed and the paths to get there, and Akil Bello, who is with FairTest and one of the most thoughtful and thought-provoking thinkers out there when it comes to standardized testing and how it fits into college admissions. This webinar is a part of the Hack the Gates project, which is a research and practice partnership between Accept and the RISE Center of Colorado State. And our goal is to radically reimagine admissions, to look at this process of the path to college and say, how can we make this equitable and just? How can we really tear this to the ground and rebuild it into something that we truly think will clear that path? So I'm terribly excited about this. And I want to thank Oyan Foon, who is unfortunately not with us today, but is the person who started this whole shenanigans of Hack the Gate. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to our first speaker, Akil. I'm going to step out, and thanks so much to everyone for coming. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen and run through a few thoughts. Before I do that, I want to say thank you to Marie and acknowledge her shirt, which is amazing. All right, so for those who don't know, I am a Hillman College grad. I've been doing test preparation for about 30 years, since about 1990. I've taught every admissions test that you can possibly imagine. I actually ran my own test prep company called Bell Curves, which I sold in 2014. So I've pretty much done everything you can think about in the test prep space, except teach for things, things that require real knowledge like the MCAT. I don't mess with that because you have to know real stuff. I'm a reformed mediocre SAT test taker. And so today what I thought I would walk through was just some basics around what test optional means and what the test optional landscape looks like and why schools have chosen test optional policies and how that all pulls it together. So in terms of a definition, accredited 4-year bachelor degree granting institutions, and test optional policies are a pretty wide range. So there's a strange dichotomy between using test optional as a blanket term and using test optional as a specific term. So we're going to try to parse a little bit of that. So currently, there are 29 institutions that have what's called test blind policies. They won't consider test scores at all, right? Test flexible, we are down to 1 institution. Not long ago, there were 3, but University of Rochester changed, Drexel changed recently, and the third one, who I can't recall right now, also changed their policy and went from optional to flexible. So there's a wide range of policies that people are referring to when they say test optional. And so it's important in these discussions to make sure that we're actually having all the same conversation. Generally speaking, we're going to talk about test optional as in the policy that allows the vast majority of students to choose whether or not to submit test scores. Okay? And to me, that's much like lots of other factors in admissions that the admission office allows the students to choose certain elements, whether they think should be included or should not be, whether an essay is required or not, whether extracurriculars are required or not. So test optional brings testing down to a level that is equivalent to pretty much every other factor in this process except for grades, right? So what we have to consider is, what the policy means and how it plays out. So let's look at a bit of a profile of the schools that are currently test optional. First, the growth of test optional has been significant, right? It started in '68 with Bowdoin, and it is currently covering about 1,250 schools. All right, so there's a huge spike that happened even before the COVID epidemic, although it has absolutely accelerated with COVID. In 2003 or so, Bennington College, whose president was Elizabeth Coleman, shout out to Elizabeth, went test optional as well. So currently we're looking at about 53% of 2,300 colleges. If we're using our denominator to calculate that percent as when you pull out of IPEDS, degree granting, US and territories, grant baccalaureate degrees and above, right? So one of the challenges in the conversation of what's a college is what's that denominator, right? So the denominator we're using is that 2,300 pulled from IPED. And so there's a growth among public colleges, and that's one of the criteria or one of the criticisms of test optional in the past has been it's primarily small liberal arts schools. That is largely true, and in part that's because of the processes required to become test optional, right? At public institutions, it requires a lot more approvals. Sometimes it's state legislature and state law. So predominantly smaller private institutions can move faster. But of late, there's been a growth among public institutions. In fact, across the entire West Coast, you can pretty much apply to public institutions without test scores going forward. So Washington, California, and Oregon, across all the public institutions. So breaking it down by numbers, right? We're talking about 700 private nonprofit institutions. We're talking about 400 public institutions is what makes up the list. If we looked at it across some states, looking at the states with the largest number of colleges, New York, of course, is on the list because shout out New York. You also have Florida where 50% of their schools are test optional. And you have that place in Massachusetts. We won't call them what we feel about them, but there's a good 85% of colleges of Massachusetts. So when we're looking across the country, right, we're having a growing number of schools allowing students to apply without submitting test scores, right? And that spans selectivity. Most of us know about Chicago, but you also have University of Denver in there. Shout out to the incoming NACAC president. Rochester's been test optional for a while, as has Wake Forest, right? And size as well. So across the institutions, we have variance in size of that applicant pool. So you have 62 institutions that admit more than 25,000 or that receive more than 25,000 applications. All right. So there's a pretty wide range of schools that have implemented test optional policies. So when we're thinking about test optional, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that institutions all across the country of every size, of every sort of spectrum or sector or denomination have chosen to institute these policies. Some as far back as the 60s, some as recent, and obviously many as recent as in the last 2 months or so. Essentially for the spring of 2020, there have been about 219 announcements. So there's a huge spike. And just for context, for the spring of 2019, there were about 20 announcements. So it's almost tenfold just as what we've seen recently. So let's think a little bit about why these policies come out and what data justifies, a reconsideration of the value that test will have in this process, right? So when Rhodes made their announcement back in the 2000s, one of the things Rhodes is a fairly recent announcement. But what I found interesting about their announcement is they essentially said they have read test blind, right? They've read test blind above a particular threshold for a very long time. The second piece I found really interesting about Rhodes's consideration was when they looked at successful academic performance, that number that they indicated was a 2.0, right? Which is important to consider in light of many of the conversations of college ready that come out of testing agencies, right? They're often looking at a number somewhat higher than that. But when we look at data from ACT, what they told us was that high school GPA alone correlates at a 0.53, and when you add testing to that, you get up to a 0.56. So one of the questions that I've consistently been asking is it worth it? Is all the time and money spent around the test worth that additive value? And it seems like a pretty low increase to be worth a $1 billion testing industry, a $1 billion test prep industry, right? And all the things that surround that. And the tests aren't particularly precise, right? And I think you can look at this in a whole number of ways. So ACT actually puts on the student report that their college readiness benchmark is a probability of getting a 75% probability of getting a C or better in a corresponding college class. But when you disaggregate that data and you actually pull out your college readiness study, if you got a 10 on the ACT, there would be a 60% probability of getting a C or better. So again, I ask, what's the value of this test, right? How much is it adding? Like, why are we going through all of this when the data from both SAT and ACT show us the same thing, that the predictive value of it is fairly low unless you start chopping up the data to present the test as a really useful tool. So if you look at the SAT, that 200 to 300 score has about a 65% chance of getting a 2.0 or greater. Right? That seems pretty good to me. So, 200, 300 is essentially guessing. A 10 on the ACT is less than guessing, right? Less than what you would score from random guessing. So how much are these tests adding to our considerations, right? And when we look at this on an individual student level, it also raises questions. And I think that there are two conversations that are concurrently happening. One is the conversation of highly selective institutions, right? Which aren't looking at the college readiness benchmarks. But then there are all the public state institutions that are more important in terms of the volume of students that they serve and how much of their admissions and placement is driven by these benchmarks put out by College Board and ACT. Well, this student was flagged as not college ready because he had a 520, but this student omitted 4 answers. Well, a 530 makes you college ready. So if this student had filled in those 4 answers randomly, the probability is the student would go from not college ready to college ready. And when I look at individual results, right, over and over, you can see students who were not aware that random guessing was preferable to leaving questions blank, and that is the potential difference between not college ready and college ready. Because there's almost no yellow in between those green and red flags on SAT score reports. So one of the huge questions around using the test becomes, to what level is it providing realistic, data that will allow these hard cutoffs that many institutions are implementing? And I think that becomes problematic, right? When they bury these kind of reports, in 300-page reports, as opposed to what I would love to see is College Board and ACT take the lead on encouraging responsible use of tests if they're used at all. And I don't think we will get there unless these tests are not used at all going forward, or at least that threat continues to be held over them. So we look at, again, more considerations from institutions, what they're saying they're focused on, and why a test optional policy would work for them, right? To put the focus on curriculum and performance in school. That kind of makes sense, right? It also diminishes the focus on these tests, which are not as standardized as the testing agencies may want us to believe. Some of you may have seen me throw this out there before. One of the things that I looked at, because I know the test fairly well, right, is that if you get 48 of 58 math questions right, on average, you'll get around a 680. But that on average means kind of nothing when the range is actually from a 630 to a 710. So the same number of questions right and wrong. And the testing agencies will argue about equating and this and that, but they don't tell us that there's a 90, a 70, 90 point difference in range depending on the test score that you have, or depending, on the test form that the student is given. That might be a 90-point fluctuation. Think about the scholarship dollars that are predicated on having received one test form instead of another, having taken the test in August instead of October, right? And that's a huge differential, right? And it's also somewhat contrary to the data College Board provides. College Board tells us the standard error of measure is 40 points. That if a student takes a test on one day and takes another test on the next day, that should fluctuate by about 40 points. Well, that may be an average. It's not what I'm actually seeing, right? And it's fairly consistent, especially with the new test. These fluctuations are fairly wide. And that makes the use of the test, especially around hard cutoffs, really problematic, right? And College Board admits to these numbers. And College Board admits to these variances, right? We see them speak about the standard error of difference, which means how much two scores need to be different before they're truly different, right? And even that is only a 68% confidence. So they're only 68% sure. In other words, they're 32% unsure whether two scores, a 10 and 1,000 and a 1060, are actually different in ability. That seems really, questionable to make thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars worth of decisions around. So the data informs many institutions around the use of the test and whether the use of the test is appropriate given all of its limitations. And so one of the things I look at when institutions go test optional is what their announcement conveys about what they're considering in making those decisions. And DePaul indicating that they wanted to look more comprehensively, which makes sense because we all are sort of advocates of looking beyond numbers. Well, the current use of testing really encourages the use of numbers and assuming that a larger number means a better student. And that's a fallacy, right? That is an absolute fallacy. And it perpetuates itself in many, many different ways. We know about all the income inequalities, but I looked at 3 years of ACT data, and it showed me that one of the things that aligns really closely to test score, right? And I looked at this by race. So the bar is showing us the percentage of that ethnic group that takes the test more than once. And the line, the yellow line, is showing us the mean score. Not surprising, not unsurprising, is that the groups that take the test more than once more frequently tend to score higher, right? Which tells us a lot about the test, right? It reinforces that this test may not be doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then those who argue for the diamond in the rough, well, the data doesn't support that, right? ACT data shows us that 85% of students taking the test have scores that are aligned with their GPA, right? A very small percentage have scores that are not aligned. College Board data tells us the same thing, although the numbers are slightly different, right? But actually, if you disaggregate those numbers and say who's scoring better on the SAT than on, than their high school GPA would say, well, it's predominantly men, predominantly white, predominantly rich, and predominantly college-educated parents. So all the arguments that the SAT allows colleges to find that diamond in the rough who underperformed at high school is actually not supported by data, right? The data actually supports the inverse, that those groups who are performing the best on these tests are advantaged by the test over their high school performance. So that raises the question around the testing agencies pushing the grade inflation narrative, which to me, that's driven in large part by APs. And is it actually grade inflation, or have students become more concerned about their GPA because of the increased competition to get into colleges? And I don't think any study has researched those elements of this process. So the data shows us that the use of the test is problematic in a whole heck of a lot of ways, right? And some of them are quantifiable, some of them are not, right? The hyper-focus on a number, the overuse of numbers. I've had people try to hire me, for several $100s an hour to get their SAT score from a 700 to a 730, while College Board is telling us that the difference is immaterial, right? And that's problematic, and that's not how this system should work. And it leads to problems, right? It leads to all kinds of ways in which money becomes the driving factor in achievement, and that's not what we want. Right? And when we look at various surveys, Princeton Review did this survey, and one of the biggest concerns about getting into college is actually taking the test, right? And that can't be what we want to do. So test optional policies not only actually provides students a pathway around the test, but it also removes perceptions of gatekeeping. And that's a piece that I don't think many people have evaluated or measured or tried to quantify, right? How many students don't apply at all because of published test scores, right? And then all of this comes back to me is that, you know, the Siverson study showed us that 2%, right? The test scores add 2% to graduation rate. So forget first year GPA. We are doing all of this with testing these billion-dollar industries to get 2% improvement in graduation rate. I can't see how that's worth the money, right? If we're talking about first year GPA, the additive value is fairly small as well. We already talked about ACT. SAT publishes a little bit better in additive value, but not a whole lot on first year GPA, either first year GPA or, you know, graduation rates. So what we have to think about is what is, you know, so removing this test allows many, you know, has many advantages across the spectrum, both direct and indirect, and it's not going to be magic. And I think that one of the problems we hear, and I think one of the reasons that this webinar is was fun and exciting to do, is the argument of test optional versus test blind. The argument of there are other factors always seems like a straw man argument to me. Just because we can't solve everything, let's not solve anything. And that's weird, right? That makes no sense, right? So yeah, we know that there are a ton of things in this process that are problematic. Test scores are one that we can address relatively quickly, relatively soon. So why not deal with that until we can finish the rest of this list? There are no silver bullets, but there are absolutely things that we can address. So I'm going to also point out that one of the sort of next phases of this is how is it tied to merit, right? And we can't ignore that test scores are often used to award merit aid. So I would love to see more schools adopt solely need-based policies, right? Not to have concurrent test optional for admissions, but test required for merit scholarships, right? I mean, for merit scholarships, we probably need to be test blind. So what are the policies that institutions are implementing that we can change that are tying money and access, because access to college is often driven by ability to pay for it. So not just admitting more students or encouraging more applications, but going the step further and enabling students to attend. Right? And those are my thoughts. I'm going to pass it over to Dominique, and then I'll be back for questions.
Okay, I am sharing my screen with y'all. Okay. Akil, can you just tell me, can you see everything?
Yes, I can.
Sweet. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Dominique Baker. I am an assistant professor of education policy at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. That's the beautiful campus that you can see at the top here. And so I am going to talk to y'all today a little bit about the research that we have on what happens when institutions adopt a test optional policy, the ways that the pandemic may be shaping, changing, interacting with traditional admissions practice, and some things that might be useful to sort of keep in consideration as we move forward. And so I'll just mention, right, that one of our big things, as we're saying, is test optional admissions enough? I have gone ahead and previewed this, right, that no, this is sort of not enough in and of itself, exactly as Akil was saying. There are many different pieces to the puzzle of finding equity and justice within admissions, but we'll talk a little bit more about that after this. And please keep submitting questions to the Q&A or through chat, and Akil and I will be answering and having a conversation after this. Okay, so I've sort of broken apart the research on what happens when institutions go test optional into sort of two buckets. And a lot of this aligns with a piece that I recently wrote with Dr. Kelly Rossinger at Penn State University in Education Next. And so one bucket is sort of the older research that is focused on test optional policies. And this older research generally finds, roughly 3 of them that most people refer to, and they sort of generally find that there is little effect of adopting a test optional policy at the university level on increasing Pell Grant recipients or Black, Latinx, or Native American students, either increasing them in sort of the admitted class or increasing them in the number of students who enroll. And so this, for a significant period of time, has been a question of, well, why would institutions adopt a test optional policy if they are sort of nominally saying that it is to increase equity and justice within an institution, but actually that's not what is occurring? Is it that the institution wants to increase its application numbers, et cetera, all these sorts of things? But one of the big key pieces to this that we want to keep in mind about these different studies is that these studies focus in some combination on these different areas. So some of them are either focused on private, highly selective liberal arts colleges. So one of these studies, actually, I mentioned, right, that a lot of this work is from a brief that I recently wrote with Kelly Rossinger. Well, Kelly Rossinger is an author on one of these. So I'm not bad-mouthing any of these studies, right? This is just a part of what science is, right? We build, we learn, and we grow off of the things that we've learned previously. So some of the studies focus only on those early adopters that Akil was mentioning. So those very highly selective private liberal arts colleges, which are very different than the more recent adopters in past years, and definitely different than the institutions that are adopting test optional in light of the pandemic. Other parts of the studies analyze a very short span of years, which restricts the outcomes. And what I mean by that is the measures that we currently have available, this is an example, the measures that we currently have available to test increases in Pell Grant recipients at colleges and universities, generally speaking, you can't break those down to say, how many Pell Grant recipients do you have in the first year, in their first year at college? Most of those measures are for all undergraduate students. And so if you think about that, if you adopt a test optional policy, you have to wait 4 years to allow 4 different classes of students to be admitted and enrolled in order to see how the Pell Grant recipient numbers shift. And so the big question becomes that if you don't allow for that additional time, it's hard to really understand if you were able to detect an effect for Pell Grant recipients because there was so short a period of time that you studied. And then the sort of third piece is that sometimes these studies compare the admissions practices at institutions that have test optional policies to institutions that don't have test optional policies. And this can be done in many ways. You could say sort of, I want to find institutions that are really similar to the ones that have test optional policies, or you could say, I want to compare test optional schools to all colleges and universities in the United States. That latter comparison is actually a problematic one because, just as Akil was saying, the institutions that have become test optional are different than the average institution in the United States. And so because of that, we could make false comparisons if we compare test optional institutions to sort of all institutions in the US. We want as much as we can to try to find institutions that are similar to the test optional ones. They just happen not to have chosen to go test optional. So that's sort of some of the older research. When we get to the newer research on the effect of test optional policies, there's a study that is currently under review for publication that looks at more recent adopters of test optional admissions. So it's the most recent analysis of these policies, and it compares them to institutions that are statistically similar. So those are all the things we're sort of hoping for when we're trying to think about what could going test optional in 2020 look like. Full disclosure, that study is written by my husband. I am not at all unbiased when it comes to thinking that my husband is awesome, but other people that are not just me also find merits within this work. But so this most recent study actually finds that there's an increase in Black, Latinx, and Native American students, and to a lesser extent, Pell recipients, when we start looking at this set of institutions that are more recent adopters of test optional policies. So basically, there is evidence that institutions, the more recent ones that have gone test optional, are actually changing the demographics of the students that are enrolling at their institution. And this is important because, again, we asked, right, like, is this a silver bullet? No. The variation in the research findings helps to reinforce that this is not a silver bullet, that institutions and their admissions offices in particular have to be proactive when they think about how they're actually going to implement test optional policies and how they're going to implement other types of structural changes. And I say this because, as Akil noted, there are several other factors that can create inequity in college admissions, including access to or knowledge of sort of advanced high school coursework, prep for college interviews, someone reviewing your college essays, whether or not students attend feeder high schools. This is a non-exhaustive list of all of the many different ways that inequity can be baked into admissions policies, reviews, recruitment. So these all have to be thought of and considered. And sort of a second piece, which is an issue for the entire institution that it's so important to note, I put on a separate slide, is we often, when thinking about equity in admissions, really focus on what did the admissions office do? And that's important. But I also think it's critical that we have to note that the things the rest of the institution does are just as valuable. The admissions office can do everything under the sun. But if the institution appears to be hostile to certain students, and that doesn't change, there's not clear, concrete steps that are being implemented to try to change that, then it doesn't matter how much the admissions office recruits. If those students know that they're not welcome somewhere, they're going to be less likely to apply, they're going to be less likely to actually enroll. So I say this to note that we will talk a lot today about admissions. This is not just an issue for an admissions office. This is a very real concern that institutions have to think broadly about who they want to educate and how they want to educate individuals. Okay, and this sort of ties in, we sort of obliquely talked about it before, but COVID-19 and test optional admissions, right? So there's been an increase of institutions choosing to go test optional. In part, this is due to the fact that there was a cancellation of the vast majority of testing from January to June of 2020. It's likely that testing will be reduced going forward as well, which creates a sort of practical reality that the students who are applying to college from high school in this upcoming academic year, if they already have test scores, it is likely that those students come from more advantaged backgrounds in order to have been able to take the test earlier. Another issue with this is that prior academic performance is traditionally measured using sort of the most recent academic term when evaluating students. So this can be that if they are applying from high school, that their junior year is a significant factor in how well students perform in their junior year is a significant factor in how well they do or their review in admissions. If students are transferring, right? Normally that's either the spring semester or the spring quarter that has a significant weight for the students. And part of the problem with that is, as we all know, around March, April, we have school shutdowns happening. We have changes in grading that are happening, students being allowed in some cases to opt in to pass fail, others not, all sorts of pieces, which will make it more challenging to evaluate the transcript of students in this upcoming academic year. An additional point is that several states actually require students to take a college entrance exam in order to graduate from high school. And so this means that when we, and that's done in part to increase the share of students from high school who are going into college. Well, due to the cancellation of testing, that's actually a really critical issue that has to be addressed. And sort of finally, it's always important to keep in mind that this is a rapid shift for a number of institutions that are already resource strapped and dealing with several other major concerns. This is not exactly the same as other institutions who may have had the opportunity to spend a year or 2 years studying the question of going test optional, deciding that they would pilot for 2 or 3 years and analyze the data in order to decide whether they were going to stay test optional or not. This is a decision that's being made in the middle of a pandemic. And there are tons of other concerns that institutions have to face, which can make it challenging to spend a lot of time rolling out on each piece of this. So I've put together just some areas for consideration, and then we definitely want to hear in the Q&A, if there are more specific questions, things like that, engage with us, push back. But what to consider both from a practitioner admissions professional standpoint and from a policymaker standpoint. At this point, I will mention, I always forget to introduce this. So I am currently an assistant professor of education policy. In my former life, before I earned my PhD, I was an assistant dean of admissions at a selective public university. And so that also informs probably a large amount of the research work that I do around admissions, and my thinking through a number of these pieces. I always forget to mention that because nobody else ever cares that I used to work at admissions, but it is germane to this topic. Okay, so what to consider for practitioners. The first thing is thinking through how students are selected, how admissions offices are going to find prospective students, particularly if an institution used to rely strongly or heavily on testing agencies to provide search lists, because there are a number of students, and this will systematically leave out certain students along racial lines, income lines, college-going generational status in the family that have not gotten their names into some of these searches yet. A second piece is that in test optional, in schools that have gone test optional previously, they've sort of made one of two choices. And one is that they either place the weight that they would have traditionally done on college entrance exams onto grades, or they sort of spread the weight that happened from college entrance exams evenly across all of the different areas of items that are being solicited by the admissions office. Part of this will likely be dictated by whether this is sort of a holistic review or a mechanized review in the admissions office, but having conversations about that now rather than later can be very helpful. And sort of the third piece, which gets to Akil's point, is that it seems to be strongly recommended that decoupling merit aid and scholars programs from exam scores sort of needs to happen. And part of that is because a number of institutions are choosing currently to go test optional because a number of students just haven't taken tests, right? We can sort of argue about ethical reasons or decision-making around going test optional, but a number of institutions are currently doing it because students don't have test scores. And so because of that, if there are merit aid or scholars programs that currently rely on test scores and that's not changed, you are sort of systematically saying that certain students do not get access to your merit aid or your scholars programs, which is highly problematic and concerning. I will mention this is just a small selection of areas for thought. I thought about putting this on the slide, but I thought that I would just sort of mention that this is also an opportunity that if offices want to try some things to see if they can push around their thinking of what holistic admissions could look like or admissions broadly could look like, this is a good opportunity. This means that if institutions want to reconsider the bump that is given for legacy admissions, this is a great opportunity to do that. There are many different things that admissions offices could do, and so it may be that this is a time to test that out. when we switch over to thinking about the sort of policymaker side, I've sort of focused on 3 areas. One is that at least in the interim, it seems that for high school graduation, we need to waive the sort of college entrance exam score requirement. It is incredibly dicey whether or not students will gain access to being able to take these tests. And they're in the interim, while we are still dealing with the fallout from this pandemic, it seems to not make a lot of sense to require this for graduation. The second 2, I will upfront say, require additional funding to states from the federal government. So I do not think that states can, with their current funding structures, fund these types of projects because they have a lot of other things that they have to fund currently during this pandemic. Number 1 is creating sort of a statewide database of the changes in secondary school grading. So in admissions, one of the pieces of paper that can be the most important in a portfolio is sort of that school profile, right? The information that we have around the context of a school that a student is experiencing, how many honors courses, AP, IB, dual credit courses are available, what is the college going rate at that high school, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we know that certain schools, certain districts are going to have less resources, economic resources, but also people, that certain districts will be more likely to have to let people go or reduce their hours. And that those districts are often the ones that serve low income, first generation college students, students of color. And so because of that, it may be that those districts don't have the capacity to update their school profiles in a way to help admissions offices really get a good understanding on context. This is something that the state could take over with documenting things like the how grade changes were shifted at the district level, as well as for my secondary piece here, the state could keep track of unemployment rates around the area for the school or infection and hospitalization rates for different areas. And sort of admissions professionals could then, if this information was either packaged or was something that could be housed on state sort of websites, this is information that could be used in an admissions review. I think it's going to be incredibly important this upcoming academic year that we keep in mind that several students have been asked to excel without a significant amount of supports that other students are being given. Thinking about broadband and access to internet, thinking about having multiple computers or things of that nature for students to be able to learn. Those are all going to be critical issues that students have had to face. And we have to try as much as we can to document that and to make sure that admissions offices are taking that type of information into consideration when they're considering how well students were able to perform in the most recent academic terms. So those are just some of the broad pieces to talk about. I try to keep this to a fairly short amount because we want to get a chance to get questions from y'all. So I'll say thank you so much for listening and we're looking forward to it. Oh, let me stop sharing. There we go.
Awesome. Okay, so why don't we start? I'm just going to scroll through some of the questions here and see if we can address some of them. I also want to point out, one thing I want to throw out there is I sort of intentionally did not talk about diversity. One thing for me is if the test is bad and the use is bad, it's just bad, stop doing it. Like, diversity may be a great outcome, and I actually am somewhat disappointed when the majority of institutions are hanging that as the sole measure of what they're looking at it regarding the test. So I think it's important for institutions to consider, is the test giving them information that they want? And if it is not, then let's get rid of it and not put the onus entirely on Black and Latinx students to carry the load for removal of the test. Right, so I think that that's an important consideration that institutions should look at.
No, I think that's fair. I think one of the things I'm talking about this from is a perspective that I think institutions should be carrying the load for saying, right, because I think a big thing here, and in the more recent study, I noted that someone was mentioning in the chat. Yes, the Rossinger, so it's Belasco, Hearn, and Rossinger is one of the pieces that people are mentioning sort of finds a different piece. That is one of the 3 studies that I was referring to. And so that work, what it found, right, is that institutions were saying that they cared about diversity, but what they were doing was increasing their application numbers with those earlier, more selective private institutions. And so part of the reason that I do think this matters is that the more recent work has shown that institutions are saying that they care about this and want to remove the test, and then actually doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that that can matter because that shows to me that some people said that they wanted to increase diversity and they made it happen. And one of the things that they say they helped to make it happen is through test optional admissions. And so I think that's part of the reason I really wanted to focus on saying this is not just about admissions, is because I think too often we scapegoat students to say, right, like, oh, they didn't know that they could go to this type of institution. And so it was sort of there on them. And if we just make them better, they'll know that this is the right choice for them. Like, a lot of students make the correct choice when they see a certain institution and they say, that institution doesn't actually want me here. Right. They're reading the tea leaves correctly. So yes, I agree. I don't think that we can put the onus on students. I think we have to put the onus on institutions.
Absolutely. And I wasn't speaking specifically. I think that's part of a huge conversation.
Right. I completely agree.
Another question that came up, which should be pretty simple to answer, someone asked about the impact on U.S. News. So one, U.S. News, can we just ignore them and burn them down? 2, U.S. News previously counted test scores, I believe, as 7% of their ranking, so it's never been huge. Actually, so I think that the claim that institutions are going test optional to game the rankings, I find so far to be false. And I say so far because I haven't finished calculating the data. Mm-hmm. I've taken the US News rankings from like 83 forward, and I'm trying to match them up against institutions, looking at the 3 years before they went test optional and the 3 years after. And for the schools I have so far looked at, their ranking has actually fallen from going test optional. So those of us or those of you who believe that they're doing it for rankings, you either believe admissions offices are really dumb, right? Or then you're believing a falsehood. Because for all the schools I've looked at about 5 or 6 nationally ranked schools, and the rankings almost always dip. So I don't think the rankings thing is a huge concern. It's actually more of a concern for the institution because they could potentially be unranked if they don't submit, if at least 75% of their students don't submit test scores, then US News won't rank them. So so the ranking things I don't think is a real active part of this consideration.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that, like, institutions were, right, so US News is updating its formula, but they were actually penalized for going test optional. Yeah, that's a big piece there.
All right, so that was one question. Any other questions you want to grab here?
So I'm noticing there were some questions around sort of the counselor side. So counselors at high schools wanting to know, like, how do I advise students, or how can counselors guide less resourced students about what to do? So I'm definitely up for your thoughts. I guess one of the things I think about is, so I will be very upfront. I have way too many nieces and nephews. I have 9, but a number of them will be applying for college in the fall. And I've already spoken to them and said, I think this needs to be the last thing on your list of concerns. This was like a month ago, maybe. I was like, look, I'm looking at these things. If you feel like this is just a lot of extra stress, just go ahead and move forward with trying the best you can do in class, and you can just move on for these other pieces. So I can't tell you what to say. I can say that I think a significant share of institutions will be test optional for this upcoming academic year, and that students should first be concerned with their health and safety and that of their loved ones. And then from there, trying to think about what they can do in their classrooms and from the academic front.
I'll echo that. And I think that, so the way I've framed it, I have to first quote Chris Latham from DC. You can't test if you're dead. You can't go to college if you're dead, right? Like that's the legit consideration right now. I live in the Bronx, New York, right? A month ago, this was the hotbed of COVID. There's no way you can send a child into a room that's 20 by 20 with 15 other kids. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So my recommendations to students has been delay as long as you can, right? Seniors are in a much tougher boat, but juniors, there's no reason for any junior to ever test before 2021, right? And by then we'll have a better sense of what's going on. So one, I would push students to delay the need to go into an official exam until that's actually necessary and until a lot of this settles down. For seniors, I think the consideration becomes, and this is a problem within the counseling industry, is gamifying the system, right? I've seen a lot of counselors who convey messages that suggest they don't believe the institution around their policies. They don't, believe that test optional means really test optional. And to me, that's varsity blues thinking. It's the thinking of, I'm trying to guarantee admissions and I need to gamify and pay for as much as I can in order to guarantee admission to this particular institution, right? And I think that thinking is problematic at best. For those of us who won't engage in that thinking, the question becomes, is it safe for you to test? Are you required to test at this pool of schools that you are looking to apply to, right? And the test optional announcement will often tell you a lot. It is clear that Georgetown wants your test. They begrudgingly announced that we will accept, if you prove it written in blood by your pastor that you could not test, we will accept that note written by your pastor in blood. Whereas other institutions, especially those announcing pilot programs, are conveying, we had been thinking about this anyway, and this was just an acceleration of a policy that was already in the pipes, right? So you have to think about what the institution conveyed in those announcements, and it may take a little bit more work to disaggregate that. But to a certain extent, you ultimately have to trust that the institution will do what they said they were going to do. And if you don't trust that the institution will do what they said they were going to do, then I turn around and ask, why are you applying there? Right? And that's in the end. So you have to think about all of those factors when you're making these decisions about how should you perceive testing in this new environment.
Yeah, and I think, I just always come back to, like, this is a life or death decision, right? So no, I'm gonna support the ways that we can try to sort of help think that through. And I think I was skimming through, and some people are talking about sort of like there are certain families who are sort of advocating for students to take the test sort of regardless, right? Because it'll give them an edge. Because as Akil outlined, if you have a test optional policy and it's not test blind, then you can still submit scores if you have them. And so what does that mean? Some people say, like, I have a concern about what may happen, that like if admissions offices are not using tests, will they rely more on counselor letters or other things like that? Because we know that those can rely on sort of who has the resources and the time. I think we have to think broadly, and this is where I think summer offers a really good opportunity to try to lay down some thoughts, some sort of soul searching in an admissions office about what matters the most to you, and how you can try to communicate that to others. If it's how you plan to incorporate using tests when students do submit tests. Do you plan to say that you will actually go test blind and you just won't consider tests, which is sort of like, right, very different than some of the institutions that Akil was just mentioning. I think a reality is this has always been a human-driven process, generally speaking. And it's not going to stop being a human-driven process in the fall. And so what we have to do is push to try as much as we can to train people to make sure that people can recognize where context and bias matters, and to try to do the best that they can to work against that.
To address a couple of the questions, so keep in mind that as we're speaking, policies are changing, right? So someone mentioned in one of the comments that Temple allows students to apply test optional regardless of GPA. I don't know whether we said that or whether someone else said that. It's irrelevant. I think that if you're counseling students, they have to research their institutions as they're applying, because these policies are changing on a day. Like, I changed my slides 3 times as the numbers changed while I was getting ready between Thursday and today, right? I had to update numbers. So keep in mind, these policies are dynamic and they're changing every single day. And the list are starting points, but you see how often Bob sends updates on the FairTest list, right? Like, so just acknowledge that these lists are all starting points. These indicators of what the exception was, what the policy was, are all starting points, and those things are going to vary if you wait a month or 2, especially now. So 1, I want you to keep that in mind. 2, someone asked a question about the TOEFL, and generally TOEFL is just for international students, so it's not really part of these conversations, and it's used fairly differently. So I'm gonna withhold any comments on TOEFL, but I just want to kind of throw that out there. And again, one of the issues around test optional is, are the policies equivalent for international students? At a lot of places, the policies are different for international students, right? So it behooves you, if that's the population you work with, to recognize that our conversation is generally restricted to policies that apply to US students. And, you know, if Laura's out there, homeschool students are also a different bucket, right? And so if you're dealing with a specialized group that's not sort of the broad group, then that means you have to be careful about how the policies apply, and do they apply specifically and intentionally to them. And when we do updates, we're going to try to do that, but often that can't be done, so you may have to do some work on your own. Any question you want to jump in on?
Yeah, I think the last one I wanted to make sure I hit was, a couple of people were asking sort of, well, okay, what do we do? Like, people have been trained to read in one way. So now all of a sudden they got to figure out how to read in another way. How are they supposed to do that? I think that this is a time that if at all possible, one of the biggest things would be that, like, this is when our organizations need to sort of take over. That if possible, the large organizations like NACAC, things like that, this is a time for them to sort of pool resources, reduce some of the burden on individual institutions, and help to provide either trainings or guidance around how you can try to think about using or not using test scores. I think Marie is about to jump in on this as well, which I think is great. I was like, aha. But so I'll just say that I think that you guys are right, that this is about training, and already cash-strapped, often understaffed admissions offices, right? It's really hard to figure out how to do these types of things. This is when we should be pooling our collective talent, our collective knowledge, in order to help each other, because most institutions that are going test optional, like, they've got to try to figure this out. And even institutions that have gone test optional previously, they still have to now say, like, well, but what are we supposed to do about if there's pass-fail, if there's not pass-fail, et cetera, all of that.
One of the really exciting things about this whole project with Hack the Gates is taking, like, brilliant researchers, and thankfully folks who have experience as well, like Dr. Baker, and talking with policymakers and talking with practitioners to say, how do we operationalize this? How do we make this happen? And so this whole idea for this webinar and this conversation started when Akil reached out and said, how do we come up with some kind of guidance of what you do after? So at the end of July, beginning of August, with the release of the other Hack the Gates research papers, we'll be writing some guidance as well of ways that you can take into consideration all of these amazing ideas and really develop ways to move forward. So we'll be reaching out to y'all for that too.
I also want to throw in here is the question of how will you do it without test scores always floors me. Like, the question comes from almost a standpoint of like test scores were the be all end all of academic evaluation. Like, how would you do it without AP grades? How would you do it without extracurriculars? How would you do it without whatever else? Like this, so to a certain extent, colleges have been navigating evaluating applications that aren't exactly lined up for years. And yes, there will be an adjustment period, but this isn't something that is impossible to do and something that is, we're not asking people to breathe underwater here, right? We're asking them to slightly adjust a process that has already been in place, right? And so I think that the language around academic readiness tied to test scores is really problematic. That kind of means you ignored all the data I put in front of you. That's just like, it's not about academic readiness. I think colleges are selective of who they want to select. And colleges are selective of who they think will help their numbers either stay where they are or move higher. And the numbers I'm thinking of are GPA and graduation rates. And once colleges look away from those things and look at simply graduation or some such thing like that, can they do the work, then test scores are probably fairly irrelevant to that. And so I think that becomes an important consideration. I would love to see more colleges release data on retention, but who did not come back but was academically eligible to do that, right? Then we can start to disassociate test scores from that, because if 80% of your pool that did not retain to the second year was academically eligible to do so, that tells you that it has almost nothing to do with academics, right? And I think that that's research that hasn't come out. And so once we start looking beyond the assumption that testing is tied to academic success, we'll get to more enriched and more thoughtful considerations here.
Amateur hour here. In theory, we're supposed to be wrapping this. You all want to take one more? I mean, we could go for days, do one more and then say we're finished, or wrap it up now and start happy hour.
The questions we haven't gotten to?
Sure. I was about to say, yeah, I'm trying to also scroll through the chat like very quickly to try to see.
So someone was asking about merit scholarships. Generally speaking, merit scholarships tied to GPA, special skills, and tests, some combination of those. So if you remove test scores from merit scholarship, then it's tied to GPA and whatever special skills. There are lots of merit scholarships that are like, you came from this high school, and that's the sole criteria. So merit scholarships aren't first of all, the name is bad, right? It's scholarships because we wanted to, right? They could do gray hair scholarships if they felt like it. Right? So that is that's actually what made me say it. That is an entirely separate consideration, and it can be done without grades. So I think that without test scores, and it's often done without grades. So I think that it's a fallacy to think that those things are intrinsically linked.
And I guess the last part I'll put in is, I think we recognize that institutions get to set their priorities. Institutions get to set the priorities for athletics, for legacies, for the children of donors, or for important individuals to the institution. You get to pick all of these types of things. And so part of the thing that is tricky is that some of these pieces are like mechanics questions and trying to better understand how you navigate that. And other parts of these are values questions for institutions. And unfortunately, right, we can't answer what the values the institution puts on different student groups, or what equity looks like, or how testing is used. So that's sort of why I sort of keep coming back to, part of this will be driven by what the board thinks, what the president thinks, and what can be navigated based on that. So hopefully some of the guidance stuff that gets put out can be helpful. I definitely think this is a space where if there are things that it doesn't seem like we're thinking about or mentioning, you can definitely reach out. We put like most of our contact info up and stuff like that. Like if we have like completely like not noticed something that like has to be in guidance for you to think through, then that's a thing to talk about, because then hopefully we can sort of pool together resources, time and thought in order to be able to try the best we can to help. But ultimately it is up to admissions offices to make those decisions.
Right. And and admissions offices, I think I've seen them try to communicate what their values are, what the factors in admissions are. The problem becomes when parents and counselors and the media don't want to believe them, right? And I think that many, especially those who are seeking admissions to highly selective institutions, they concurrently want two separate and contrary things. They want admissions to be holistic for their child, but they want it to be predictable by test score and GPA, right? And those things are almost diametrically opposed, right? And so part of the issue is trying to diminish that type of thinking, that you're saying, I want a system that is entirely predictable for my child, but not so much for everybody else, right? Or not so much if my child won't get in, right? So that's the challenge we face. There are many, many things that institutional priorities, sports, legacy, all of these things that should be interrogated. And the test is merely one of them.
This has been really fun. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I feel like we should do this again soon. But really, I feel like this has been a fantastic, really thought-provoking conversation that just laid out some really clear guidance and direction and just the truth. So I appreciate you both so much. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks everyone.
We will send out a recording and information ASAP. Look for more webinars with Accept and with Hack the Gates, and we're going to have a lot of great stuff, like I said, towards the end of July with our different policy papers coming out. It's going to be some good stuff. So thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.